Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
It is okay to feel sad and disappointed, but please know it's going to be okay. On the campaign, I would often say, when we fight, we win. But here's the thing. Sometimes the fight takes a while. Do not despair. This is not a time to throw up our hands. This is a time to roll up our sleeves. This is a time to organize, to mobilize, and to stay engaged.
Welcome to a very special edition of Quiet Riot. Today's show is brought to you in conjunction with Best for Britain, the pro-European campaign that changes minds by changing politics by changing minds. I'm Naomi Smith.
And I'm Alex Andreou, the star to Naomi's stripes, if I say so myself. For those of you who don't know, Naomi and I both work for Best for Britain, she as CEO and I as an occasional social media grunt. By night, we podcast.
And when we started this show a few months ago, really not very long ago at all, our ambition was to bring passion without the shouting, analysis without too much spin, but most of all, to bring to our listeners calls to action so that you can turn impotent fury into meaningful endeavour.
Impotent fury is right today, I think. With Trump taking the presidency, Senate, and quite possibly the House, it feels more necessary than ever to take a breath and look at what is going on. So grab whatever beverage or treat helps get you through the dark times, turn up the volume, and join us for a US election special, Quiet Riot.
Welcome to Quiet Riot.
I'm Alex. There is no other way to begin. The world has become a more dangerous place.
And I'm Naomi. Other British political commentators have made some pretty bad calls lately, offering false hope, and we don't do that. And no names shall be mentioned, but we'll try never to do that. And today is no exception, but we will be offering hope and action.
Today's show is a first for many reasons, not all of them good. It is our first live recording. It's our first co-production with Best for Britain, our first in front of cameras, and our first since Trump's fresh victory.
2024 has been called the year of elections. Around 100 countries and 4 billion people going to the polls around the world. And today, you all know, America chose Trump. In doing so, they've chosen a convicted felon who may embolden Putin, threaten NATO, deny climate change, start trade wars, and risk the lives of millions of women. But if we know anything at all about Trump, it is that he is volatile and unpredictable and prone to changing his mind.
And transactional. So it would be disingenuous to say with any sort of conviction what he will or will not do. So we won't. Instead, we will focus on fact, not fiction, on hope rather than despair. Believe it or not, today is National Stress Awareness Day. And
I am very aware of my stress.
And in order to reduce our stress and yours, while trying to deconstruct what went wrong and what comes next, we have roped in 2 emotional support panelists, 2 giants of political thinking to help us. It is our immense privilege to have them on the panel with us today.
Our first guest is Mark Malloch Brown, and when he speaks, the world should listen. He first cut his teeth on Fleet Street before establishing a formidable diplomatic career, rising to become Deputy Secretary General of the UN under Kofi Annan, and is the immediate past president of the Open Society Foundations. Mark, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Naomi.
What advice do you think, the godfather of open society and its enemies, Karl Popper, give us today?
Well, I hope he would be astute enough to realise that in the elections this year, it's been a bad year for incumbents. And, there were some underlying trend lines here. And when I spent a decade of my life as a political consultant, I was always taught, don't look at the horse race number, look at the underlying trends. And here you had an electorate, like in much of the world, that wanted change, that was frustrated with the economic situation, frustrated with migration. Two concerns globally this year, actually. When a challenger candidate is viewed as the candidate of change, is viewed as leading on those two issues, then they're probably going to win. And I think in that sense, Popper would be wise not to turn in his grave too much and believe it was an up and down vote on democracy. It was a pocketbook vote.
And our second guest is the CEO of 38 Degrees, a people-powered movement with 1 million members, I think now, campaigning for a fairer, more respectful world. Matthew McGregor, delighted you could make it today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're also a US citizen.
I don't sound like it, do I?
No, you actually voted, and you're a dad. If you were still living in the US today, would you be packing up or digging in?
Well, my wife and I lived in the States for 10 years. She's American, which is why I am now as well. We moved to the UK in 2018 to be closer to our parents. So it was a family choice rather than a political choice. And I think if I was there, I would want us to dig in because, especially for those of us who have a privileged position in society. I'm not one of the people that Donald Trump is particularly gunning for. I think it's incumbent on us to be part of that fight back. But at the same time, I think this second defeat after 2016 is going to be incredibly demoralising for people. And I'd make no judgment on anyone who took a different decision and decided to walk away for a bit.
Now, let me give you an idea how this episode will shape up. It is broadly divided into 4 parts, not of equal length. First, we look at the result and what it means for America. Then we turn to implications for the UK specifically. In the third segment, we will cast a wider eye on the geopolitical implications of another Trump White House. And finally, we turn to what next and calls to action.
So let's begin with what went wrong and what it means for America. Matthew, she technically wasn't an incumbent, but Mark has mentioned that Harris, like incumbents across the West, are struggling. Mostly, it seems, because everyone feels just financially worse off. To what extent was what we saw last night simply about the economy?
I think it was to a great extent. I worked on the 2012 Barack Obama re-election campaign. I remember early on in that campaign being briefed about focus groups that we'd been running of people that had voted for Barack Obama in 2008 and then voted for an extreme Tea Party candidate in 2010. And one story really stood out for me. It was a dad who said that all I want in life is to have a good job so I can afford to own my own home and send my 2 daughters to school, to university. And because of the crash, I have lost my job, my house has been repossessed, and I can't send my kids to uni. And I'm going to vote to fire people until my life gets better. And I think what we're seeing as a result of this cost of living crisis that has swept the world is politicians being fired in country after country, and that will continue happening until people's lives get better.
And Mark, when we look at the demographic breakdowns that we've seen so far, there was a Harris underperformance with many demographic groups that pollsters didn't quite catch. Latino voters, even women, were not turning out for Harris in the numbers that many of them had anticipated. Is it the same issue for them? It's purely an economic one?
I think it's a bit more than that. I think there is also, frankly, a class versus identity issue. I think a lot of Latinos feel that they are entering the middle class and they kind of want their vote to be consistent with their life in the suburbs, their membership of a country club or whatever it is, and actually resent the way Democrats treat them in this sort of cultural identity way and tend to lump them together as a group who want a particular set of services or support from the state. And they say, no, we're, middle class, able to stand on our own feet, etc. Now, having said that, yes, this group also felt the impact of prices. And, my wife and I, until very recently, had a home in rural Pennsylvania in a county which has switched in this election from blue to red. And, we were shocked as sort of wealthy visitors, relatively wealthy visitors by the standards of the county, going into our local supermarket. I completely get it. Food and fuel inflation was very, very high in the US, and people really did put it at Biden's doorstep. They considered, his early government surge in spending as inflationary, and, they considered him and his administration largely deaf to their complaint.
Let's stick with Biden. Harris had fewer than, 150 days or something to win this. She's selected mere weeks before the convention. Was there anything her campaign could have done differently? Because she seemed to run a bloody good campaign, all things considered. I think she ran a very good campaign, and, I'm like everybody else on this panel, mortified and mourning the fact she didn't make it. But, the real sort of, in a sense, the person who lost this campaign was Joe Biden and those around him who, in some ways, cynically kept him propped up and in office long after he should have been allowed to declare himself not a candidate, and preventing the kind of primary process, which is the way, American politicians or presidential candidates in the white-hot heat of a primary get toughened up. And I think the one area where strikingly she was very weak was the very issue she was most vulnerable on, the economy. She simply didn't have the personal confidence to talk forcefully and persuasively about the economy, and nor was she willing to distance herself from Biden on what was the issue that was dragging first him down and then later her down. Alex, I'm sure you've got questions on what this means for America.
So many questions. I would agree from everything I've seen, and I've been watching network news probably compulsively for about 6 months now,
often
day and night.
Simultaneously on different screens, different channels.
Every voter I saw vox popped cited the economy. And so I think it's easy to have the hot takes and to jump to, America just hates women, or they're all racists. But actually, the simplest explanation is that America, as it almost invariably does, voted with its pocketbook. And that makes, I think, Trump's mandate quite tricky in a strange way. Because if it is interpreted as that culture wars mandate that talked about 70% tariffs and deporting millions of migrants, well, that will cause an economic shock that then alienates actually the larger demographic that I think voted for him because they want a better economy. I know this is the all is lost moment, but people like Trump tend to unravel the more unimpeachable they feel, the more untrammeled their power is. And
untrammeled this is. Yeah. He controls the Supreme Court,
the Senate
and possibly the House.
Possibly the House. And I keep going back to that, my favorite H.L. Mencken saying that democracy is the idea that people know what they want and deserve to get it good and hard. The last three races, the thing they have in common is that Trump does better as an insurgent than as an incumbent. The concept of Trump, I think, is more attractive to the electorate than the reality of Trump. So they'll get a reminder, I guess.
The pocketbook issue was absolutely front and centre and has driven not only this election, but elections around the world over the course of the last 2 years. But I also think it is worth us remembering that for a lot of Americans, the impact of the rollback of reproductive rights, the fact that women are losing their lives because of it, was not a deal breaker. And that is an incredibly hard and painful thing for American women and all Americans to be waking up this morning to know that their fellow countrymen didn't view that as a deal breaker. I think that's something that is incredibly difficult. Yes, economic issues are front and centre, but there are other issues in this election, and those the fact that those weren't important enough to get this vote landing in a different place is something that is going to be incredibly painful and difficult for people to absorb.
Am I right that actually in those 7 or 8 states where there was an abortion referendum on the ballot, actually the abortion rights vote led Harris by a significant margin?
Yeah.
In other words, it didn't give her the coattails you might have anticipated. And you're the experts, but I kind of suspect that was because they didn't think, frankly, in a place where it was always likely that the Republicans would have the Senate and would certainly have the Supreme Court, people may have felt, well, she can't do much about it. So I don't know. So I think they may have considered, we care about this, hence our vote in the referendum, but, we're not going to make our presidential vote hostage to it, because while she shares our concern, she's going to be powerless on this.
Also, I think that assumes that everyone believed all of this about Trump. And I think a significant obstacle of the Harris campaign was overcoming the notion that, well, he was in charge for 4 years, and it didn't lead to the...
And his advisors have been out saying that throughout this campaign. His more moderate spokespeople that are political advisors to the campaign will say, look, he talks the rhetoric to get the vote out, but when you look at policy, when you look at what he actually does, he's not that bad. Don't worry about it. Stop believing the hyperbolic nonsense from the left-wing media, mainstream media. We know that he won't be that bad. I think that did cut through. I do, though, particularly as a woman, find it utterly terrifying. When we look towards Italy, Meloni has just banned you from being able to access IVF at home or abroad. Most people see this as an attack on gay rights, on LGBT couples that need to access IVF in order to have children. But, it feels like we're only one step away from that now in the US as well. And of course, reproductive rights are so intrinsically linked to the power of your purse. When you can't afford to have children, you need to be able to not have more children. That's incredibly important. But I'd like to come back to one thing. Here in the UK, we had a disaster budget a couple of years ago that spooked the markets. Trump will presumably extend tax cuts, particularly for his friends and the rich, but he may not cut spending. So the deficit in the US could be, even bigger, could grow. Did any of us feel that the financial markets might finally lose their patience and he could take a hit from that?
Well, I think he's, in a sense, got the cushion of the dollar being the global currency. It gives you a freedom to sort of behave badly that's not granted to Liz Truss and her kind. But, already the estimates are that either candidate was going to hugely increase the deficit, and there's got to be a point where there is some sort of dollar flight. But at the moment, it's going the other way. The dollars are going home from the rest of the world.
Quiet, Riot. Behind the bright lights and adrenaline of pro sport is an equally exciting world of negotiations and deal making.
That's what we cover each week on our podcast, The Deal.
I'm Alex Rodriguez, former baseball player turned business executive.
And I'm Jason Kelly, chief correspondent for Bloomberg Originals. Over the next couple months, we'll hear from all-stars like Jay Williams.
I want to be an owner one day.
Billie Jean King.
Learn the business.
And so many more. Listen to The Deal on Spotify.
While we're on the topic of what all of this might mean for America, we need to discuss the Constitution. So, Mark, Matthew, both of you will have views on this. One of the things that got a lot of coverage at the time, and again, is it one of those rhetorical devices he uses in a campaign, or is it, potentially meaningful? But at more than one rally, he hinted that if he wins, don't worry, you won't have to vote again. I think he was particularly speaking to some Christian right groups when he said that stuff. Is there any genuine risk that he is going to try and amend the Constitution in a significant way?
I think that the actual amending of the Constitution is, in a legal sense, incredibly difficult to do. You're talking about 2/3 of the states and, both houses of Congress and so on and so forth. There's a reason the Constitution hasn't been amended for very, very many years in this age of polarization. I think constitutionally we should worry about the Constitution being honoured more in the breach, the willingness of Donald Trump to break the unwritten rules, the norms, the democratic norms, and to use the power of the state in ways that really the founders and Congress and managing the Constitution since never anticipated. The willingness to completely break the supposed wall between the White House and the DOJ, for example, and as he has said, to go after his political enemies. He has openly said that he wants to go after people that have disagreed with him in this election. He has openly talked about controlling the media. And so I think I'd be less worried about the kind of constitutional wrecking and more the kind of authoritarian democracy that we've seen in Hungary, for example, something that is possible in the existing framework that they've got.
It's amazing to think that yesterday we were talking about the prospect of him going to jail if he didn't win, that his various misdemeanors could land him behind bars. Now he appears above mere justice. Mark, what are the implications for America's justice system as a whole?
I think they're huge, because even if we agree that he primarily won on pocketbook issues, he is going to govern on his, as his opponents feared, on future of democracy issues. And this is a man who has every reason to believe at this point that he is above the law. He's been elected president despite being a convicted felon, despite having a huge number of charges outstanding against him, federal ones which will now no doubt get swept away or under the carpet.
Pardoned.
He pardoned. Well, he's already got such an exemption from the Supreme Court about actions done when in office, that you do have an individual who's, only got one term left now, who could indeed govern incredibly rashly when it comes to issues of constitution and the rights of individuals, particularly his political opponents. I think we should fear the worst.
Now, we turn inwards for a moment and reflect on what Trump's victory means for the UK domestically and its relationship with the US. We'll come on to what it means for us in the global space later. But for now, I want to ask Mark, if it really was about people feeling poorer, what must Starmer do now to ensure he doesn't suffer that incumbency fate of other progressive leaders in a few years' time over here?
Well, I think he does have a challenge, let's put it that way, because I think this was, as I'm sure you've observed on this podcast before, a very thin victory. He won on a lower portion of the vote than Jeremy Corbyn had secured. And, it was very much, I think, a vote against the last government rather than a vote for Starmer. So I think in that sense, he's got his work cut out, and he's had a bumpy start too, which doesn't help. So, I think he's going to have to deliver for people. And I've just this week, watched at a meeting of business leaders, Rachel Reeves speak, and the frankly near silence with which she was greeted and the difficulties the hosts had in making sure nobody walked out before she spoke. This is a government which is already facing a lot of resistance around a perception that it's old Labour tax and spend, where's the growth strategy, etc. And so, while I think many of us think that the foundation to growth is stronger public infrastructure and improved services, I'm not sure he'll be given the time to prove that proposition first before people demand growth and increases, in their household incomes. And he's going to be very challenged to deliver that. Britain has got, for all sorts of post-Brexit reasons, baked in low growth in its economy.
I think there's a real danger from this result for the UK, which is that the Labour Party and progressives more generally will suffer a crisis of confidence. There were bold progressive economic policies that were implemented and objectively not electorally successful, but objectively successful in terms of rebuilding the economy and investing in the long-term infrastructure that the United States needs. And I think what we know from this election and from other elections is that people will vote on the basis of their lives being changed. In the current environment, caution is the riskier option. The Labour government needs to drive forward, probably even more boldly than Rachel Reeves set out in her budget, to get the economy going and invest in the kind of things that will get that jobs market going again, get wage growth going again. And I'm worried that they'll have a crisis of confidence and actually be more cautious. And at the moment, in the world that we live in, electorally and economically, caution is the riskier approach.
I think that's a good point. And the further sort of lessonette I take out of it is that this assumption that if the economy is doing better by the end of your term, the electorate will forgive you. You know, again, I think Starmer needs to look at Biden and realize that once the voters settle into the perception that you're not doing enough for them, even though objectively the American economy was doing very well by the end of his term, compared to other G7 economies, it was going positively gangbusters. But, you know, once that is entrenched, that, you know, you don't care about them and you're not doing the right things for the economy, it's really difficult to dislodge.
And you've got a campaign. And you'll know this, I'm sure, but the Democrat Party machinery hadn't kicked in sufficiently in time. You really need to have that infrastructure. And we've criticised leaders like Johnson for being campaigning prime ministers rather than governing. Of course you need to do the governing. You need to turn the economy around. You've got to deliver that growth that you stood on the platform to deliver. But you've got to tell people about it. You've got to be out there doing all of that. What lesson from the kind of party machinery can we take from where maybe the Democrats haven't done so well?
Feelings don't care about your facts, and the reality of it is that when you are explaining with graphs and charts, you're probably losing. I think that the machinery of the Harris campaign was second to none.
At the end, but not for the not during the Biden years.
Not all the way through the Biden years, no. And I think that's, you know, Keir Starmer said something that really concerned me during the election campaign. He said, I believe in action, not words. If you want to be a successful prime minister in the year 2024, you need to do both. It's not just action, but it is words as well. The machinery of the Democratic campaign over the course of the last, probably say 6 months, in terms of the way in which they operated their fundraising, the paid advertising, the grassroots organising, was really, really second to none. But that was not tapped into where people were at and how they felt about their own lives and the future for their families and their communities.
Well, on the economy, there was a report out very late last night, early this morning, from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, saying if Trump does proceed with the 60% tariffs on Chinese goods and 10% on goods from everywhere else, the resulting trade war would lower UK growth by 0.7 points in the first year, 0.5 in the second. Mark, on our last episode, I described the Reeves budget as a Brexit tax budget. We are all paying the price of Brexit through increased taxes and especially lower growth. So this is a big question, but does the new Trump presidency mean the Labour government has now no option but to drastically try to improve the trading relationship with Europe?
I think that may well be a consequence, and a happy consequence, if that happens. But it's some other things are going to happen too. I mean, if he cuts taxes in the way he intends to, claiming that tariffs are going to be his new source of income and therefore taxes can go down, I mean, there's an economic illiteracy at the centre of that, which may make it not work. But were it to work, then, you know, I think Rachel Reeves is going to have a real problem with the level of corporate and personal taxation that there now is in the country. Because, frankly, that sort of expatriate business elite, some of them non-doms, many of them not, but just working in London, you know, for them, the alternative home has never actually been Frankfurt or Paris. It's been going back to New York and Chicago. And if you get a tax-cutting budget from Trump, you know, you could actually see a real exodus of Americans from London, and with them, the taxes they pay. So, yes, I think we should improve our European trade relationship, but we tied ourselves as the sort of competitive ally, transatlantic ally of the US. So, you know, when the US goes in a particular economic direction, it can be very hard for us to swim in the opposite way.
But Mark, do you not think that the opposite might also be true, that crisis is also an opportunity, that there might be an enormous number of very bright people, scientists, academics, entrepreneurs, that are now maybe packing their bags and looking for another English-speaking country because they cannot bear culturally where their own country is going? And might we make it much easier for them to come over here?
I think it's a really interesting counterpoint, and I think, you know, it is the case. I mean, I have to say that going back to Trump 2016, but also, you know, to various other Conservative Republican victories over the years, one's always had one's liberal New York friends tell one they're looking in London or Montreal or Paris for a second home. Ultimately, they the normal ties of family. I don't know. It doesn't seem to happen. But look, I think the fundamental point really is if he goes with these very high tariffs, and he is, after all, those around him are saying, well, it's a bargaining tactic, other than the Chinese ones, maybe they won't be as high ultimately. He is not only going to throw the American economy into deep confusion over the medium term, he's going to throw the global economy into a chaotic state where, more trade with Europe is a bit of a silver lining, but the net, as you said, Naomi, is anemic growth is going to be even more anemic.
Alex, you had a very good show last week that we put out with Professor Jakob Oberg, where he was talking about defence. That's the area, not so much trade necessarily, but defence is going to ratchet up the agenda.
He was sort of wrapping the two into each other, because he was saying that the reason the relationship between the UK and the EU is not being repaired with more urgency now is that it's not particularly high on the EU's list of priorities, and actually the Starmer government is not acting as if it's particularly high on theirs. And so the Trump victory pushes defense to the top of the list of both, especially with Ukraine, and defense is where the UK has the most to offer. So suddenly this hugging closer to each other becomes much more likely, because much more oxygen and attention will be given to that relationship, considering what's across the Atlantic. So that was his.
And if you've not listened, go and grab that episode, please. I'd like to talk about the fabric of UK society. And Matthew, in a previous life, you worked for the absolutely brilliant campaign Hope Not Hate, fighting the far right. We cannot divorce the rationale that bad actors, populist, nasty, vicious, often fascist thugs will give to young people, in particular young men, about the economy failing them. They give them some kind of validation. So we can't divorce it entirely from the point that we were just talking about. But how much more important is it going to become for us to be acutely aware of the threat of the far right in the UK as a consequence of a Trump victory?
I think it's going to be a huge part of our lives for the next few years, even more so than the rise of reform and the rise of the street movements around people like Tommy Robinson would have made it. It will give that dynamic rocket fuel, and organisations like Hope Not Hate are absolutely vital, and they can only survive with our support. So I'd really encourage people to sign up to Hope Not Hate and to support them if you can. I think it's important to start by saying that Donald Trump is someone who has, throughout his entire lifetime, said and done incredibly racist things. His own chief of staff, his own chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, have both described him as a fascist. And I think there'll be people of colour and other minoritized communities around America, but also further around the world, looking at this with horror and pain. And that's something that we need to centre in whatever we do next. I think what this result will do is give people like Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson an incredible morale boost. This is something that is tremendously exciting for them, that will give them encouragement, potentially future funding from some of the people around Trump. And I think it just exacerbates the challenge that we've already got. Ultimately, the challenge of the radical right, the far right in Europe, is something that is homegrown. I think it's important that we recognise the danger of Trump and the danger of Trump's election bolstering those forces in Europe. But the AfD, Reform, the Front National, Sweden Democrats, these are not Trump organisations that came from nowhere. They are homegrown, that are feeding on the dynamics of those individual countries. And I think it's important that we look first at those dynamics and the way in which our economy is failing working class people, the divisions that we have in our society, and the powerlessness that people feel in a modern economy that's not built for them. So both of those two things can be true at once, but I think we need to make sure we're thinking about both of those and not externalizing this out and blaming the big bad Americans.
And again, I think the same goes the other way around. So it's easy to over extrapolate a little bit. what if he becomes another Orban? Well, let me tell you, Americans are not Hungarians. You know, they're not steeped in generations of living under an oppressive regime. And there are tens of millions of people who reject Trump and who are actually quite concentrated in urban economic powerhouse areas. So the idea that he can do whatever he wants and there will be no blowback, I think, is to overinterpret the result a little bit. You know, there's midterms coming in 18 months. If his popularity has plummeted by that point, there will be a lot of nervous senators and House of Representative people looking nervously at what's coming in 18 months. So it is as unbridled as his power will get, but it is still in an American context, which has a lot of checks and balances, and we have to remember that, or we will go nuts.
My final question in this section before we move on, Mark, I'm going to put to you, the other person very much emboldened, if you watched PMQs this morning, was Kemi Badenoch, the new leader of the Conservative Party, and listeners will talk more about her shadow cabinet appointments in Sunday school. We won't get into it today. But she used the very obvious pop at Starmer about David Lammy, Foreign Secretary's comments about Trump. I don't know if you have any kind of view on it at all, but might we see a reshuffle of our own here as a consequence of the election of Trump?
I don't think as a consequence of the election of Trump. For what there may be other reasons, but you know, Trump himself has a vice president now, J.D. Vance, who is almost equally rude about Trump in his day as David Lammy has been. And you know, I do know from someone who was at the dinner that actually Lammy, particularly when he and Starmer went to dinner at Trump Plaza in New York, actually connected quite well with Trump. I mean, they sort of similar sort of backslapping, glad-handing political types in a way. And so, you know, whereas I think Starmer probably found the whole thing
bit awkward.
You know, these are two big gregarious men. So
Yeah.
I doubt that it's going to lead to that kind of consequence.
Good.
It's funny, we were talking about that before we started recording.
Yeah.
We were saying that Lammy, big guy, presents as a bit of an alpha. He'd probably get along quite well with Trump in a weird way.
Okay, let's turn our attentions now to the geopolitics of all of this. Trump has said things about tearing up NATO, that he would end the war in Ukraine on day one, whatever that means, and has pledged huge tariffs, not least on China. Mark, let's start with Putin's advance. Russian election interference across the West is well documented. Has Putin played a significant role in the return of Trump? And what is this going to mean for Ukraine and potentially beyond Ukraine?
Look, I mean, it may be that we'll hear FBI reports once the elections are over of more interference than we've been aware of. There are sort of rules about not exposing too much of that in the actual election period for fear of, you know, having a unsettling, unbalancing effect on the outcome. But, you know, bar that kind of revelation, I think Putin will be pleased with the result, but I think probably there was less Putin in this outcome than there possibly was in 2016. But, you know, what it means then for Ukraine, I think is a bit less clear. I mean, you know, Trump said, I'll close the war in a day or something, but in truth, Putin is now doing well enough militarily in the field and has a vanity and ego of his own that he's not actually going to want Trump stepping in as the broker to give him the peace that he wants to get on his own terms via close to a surrender by the Ukraine side. So I think Trump's going to find this one trickier than he anticipates.
Well, I hope so. And what can the UK do? Can it take a bigger role in NATO? Can it take greater leadership among the liberal democracies? Is there a moment now for the UK, which is still a medium-sized country? You know, we're not the great imperial power we once were, and in a couple of decades' time we might be quite a bit smaller than we are now. But it feels to me like there is a window here and now where we could step in to a vacuum that Trump might create. and show some leadership within those global organisations?
Well, I think we should, and I hope within those organisations, as you say, NATO, the UN, Bretton Woods institutions, I think people are going to be crying out for some strong leadership to replace a likely American vacuum. But we are going to have to pick our fights, and I don't mean that, those literally pick our issues, perhaps I should say, carefully, because we don't have American-sized power to spread around. And I think Ukraine is a tricky one, because yes, we want to make sure that Putin is not rewarded for his aggression. On the other hand, nor for the UK or Europe as a whole is just a war without no end date to it.
But is there something Biden could do? He's now got 2 months. Is there any chink of hope that he could do something big?
In Washington, the expectation is he's going to try more to do something on the Middle East, particularly Lebanon, and maybe from that to the hostages in Gaza, than Ukraine. Frankly, the Ukrainians have rather led the Biden administration by the nose since the beginning of this, and frankly have led the Brits by the nose too. I mean, there should have been from the very beginning, despite the horrors of what Putin did, a much more serious backtrack to try and find a negotiated solution. Instead, British and American politicians have sort of marched to Zelensky's tune, and so now we have a war which, from the Ukrainian point of view, there's only one way to go, which is more weapons, more support, because they're losing, and where, frankly, that minus the Americans is not necessarily a realistic way forward.
What about China? Regardless of whether the full force of the tariffs come in or not, what opportunities and threats will they see both politically and economically in this new geopolitical environment we find ourselves in?
Well, I would say two things on China. One, obviously, this is going to be very distorting to China trade. Whatever percentage of growth we think we're going to lose, tariffs will do a hell of a lot worse to China. I think they are readying themselves for possibly having to lead a sort of second economic bloc in the world. I don't think it's the BRICS based, and I don't think it's their first choice. I talk a lot to them. I think they'd still prefer that this sort of globalized world, which has made them rich, could continue, but they're recognizing that American hostility may make that impossible. And I think the second issue is they may be tempted to do something on Taiwan. Trump is much less clear about his commitment to the defense of Taiwan than any American president before him, including Trump 1. So, there is, some risk there.
Climate. That is also a major, if not the most major, geopolitical risk we face. Let's assume he's going to deregulate. He's going to bin off much of Biden's environmental regulation. He might not row back on some of the subsidies that the IRA helped on in terms of renewables, but can we expect that he's going to take the US out of the Paris Agreement?
I think he'll want to do whatever makes him feel good in any particular moment on climate, and he listens to the people that have funded him and who he's been in the social circles with for very many years. It's a kind of a toxic combination of his friendships and his financial interests that are combined together. I think at the very least we're not going to see the sort of American leadership that we have over the last 4 years, as imperfect as it has been, and I think that will have quite a significant ripple effect around the world. I think that, for example, the quite bold policies that we've seen coming out of the Labour government in their initial few weeks and months in office will come under increased scrutiny and both economic and political pressure. So at the very, very least, this is not going to even have the level of urgency that it has had, not nearly enough urgency, but that's going to go away. And that's the best case scenario. So
although again, I feel I need to temper this with a sort of counterpoint that is, again, if America ceases to be interested in the development of these technologies and having a leadership role in these kinds of markets, that again might be an opportunity for a country that doesn't succumb to that idea. And in the long arc of the fight against climate, actually 4 years of slightly less enthusiastic stuff is a blip, all right? So we have to We have to have a level of detachment to get through the next 4 years. It has to be looking at a slightly bigger picture.
And listeners who haven't followed Alex since 2019, straight after that election, pretty much immediately, you said Johnson will unravel.
I said Johnson will be gone within 2 years.
Election.
Because it's clear to me that kind of personality, it really spins out of control when it doesn't have things that constrain it. It is a danger. The person that can undo Donald Trump, just like the person that can undo Boris Johnson, is Donald Trump, has always been Donald Trump. So Donald Trump unleashed is a very dangerous thing for Donald Trump.
Okay, let's go into lessons learned, and very importantly for all our listeners, the calls to action, the things that we can do, the things that we would ask our governments and our elected representatives to do. This was an election of many firsts, not least the billions raised for the campaign, the fact that 2 attempts on his life during it. What can the Democrats, Matthew, learn from all of this? From Biden's withdrawal, the rise of Harris, what are they likely to want to take from this, or is it far too early to comment?
I think that they wouldn't want to start from here. Would be the first point. There will be lots of lessons for them to learn, and I think that in moments like this, it is important to know that there's no one big thing, there's lots of little things. Obviously, there'll be a discussion about Biden not standing down before he did, about the lack of a contested primary to replace him, a debate over the economic policies that have built, I think, a medium and long-term economic base for some success economically in the States, but haven't filtered through to individuals. I think there'll be huge debates around the class versus identity point that Mark made earlier. And as is traditional, both in the Democratic Party in particular, but progressive parties all over the world, there'll be some really unpleasant and vicious infighting to go along with the whole thing. I think that it's likely that Democrats will take a while to do that post-mortem. And I think that makes this lame duck Congress and Biden's presidency, it's not something I'd hold out a lot of hope for in terms of action.
They'll just be licking their wounds.
I think so. And I think it will make 2025 quite I think the Democratic Party is likely to be fairly placid. At the same time, there is an opportunity for Democratic leaders to step forward and to show that they get it and they have ideas and they have a fight. I think that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez worked incredibly hard, and it is demonstrating an incredibly thoughtful and pragmatic approach to pushing bold progressive policies. So I'm really interested to see what she does. I think Gavin Newsom and the way that he's governed in California is going to be another pathway that Democrats will. So there'll be Democratic leaders who will come through.
In the middle of those two, that's the problem.
Sure.
I think for starters, I don't think they will pick a female leader for a good long while, I'm afraid.
Mark, what should internationalist progressives the world over do now? We had Scholz and Macron out very early this morning. Macron tweeted, "I've just spoken with Chancellor Scholz. We will work towards a more united, stronger, more sovereign Europe in this new context." What did he mean? What should Liberal Democratic leaders be doing now?
Well, I think it's a very Macron-like attempt to sort of fill that void. Trouble is, both he and Scholz are about to get their own shellacking at forthcoming elections. So, look, it's going to be very difficult. And I think the progressive side of politics in many of our countries, because Britain was the happy aberration. I mean, great what happened here, but most places the pendulum is thoroughly swinging the other way, and it's going to be absolutely incumbent on those who think of themselves as social democrats or progressives or anywhere there to really profoundly rethink their offer and start by listening to people. I mean, I'm very much one of those who feel that in many ways it's the progressives that have lost this rather than the right that's won it. There is, just on CNN this morning, David Axelrod, who, was my generation of political consulting and the brilliant sort of navigator of Obama's victories, observed Democrats care about working Americans, but they're like missionaries coming out to visit them and telling them they hope they can allow them to live like they do, rather than hearing what working Americans want and developing an offer that addresses it. And that needs to happen in Europe as well. I mean, I think we've just got a lot of very metropolitan, out of touch centre-left parties that need to reconnect with their grassroots.
Last question then to all of you. What should our listeners be doing? Alex, I'm going to come to you first.
I mean, there's some soft stuff, I think. Reach out to progressive friends in the US. It is important for them not to feel isolated right now. It will be... I can't imagine what it must be like to wake up in the States today as a Muslim or a woman or an LGBT person. I just can't fathom the anxiety they must be feeling. And it's really important in those moments, we know from when Johnson was elected or Brexit happened, to feel that the world outside does not see you as a monolith who made that choice, and to know that you have support and that you're seen. So I would say reach out.
I'd add to Canadians as well, because they must be feeling pretty scared right now too.
On the more practical stuff, I would say let's start by moving off Twitter. And let's start by pressing government to stop using Twitter as its sole and main communication channel.
Yeah, absolutely. And Musk, we all wait to see what role he will be granted. Mark, what can listeners do as opposed to prime ministers of social democracies?
Well, grieve a bit first. Yeah. And then, having done that, I completely agree this sort of point about trying to express solidarity to friends and acquaintances in America and indeed elsewhere. But I think there is a wider point that when politics fails, it is a time when, there is space for some sort of international policy collaboration at the non-political level. And I think this really is a time to try and make institutions like the United Nations, which are in their own crisis of relevance and legitimacy at the moment, to at least see if we can infuse some new hope and energy into them. And I would say the same about the EU, even if we're not members of it. It's time to find other levels of collaboration and policy making beyond reliance on an increasingly nationalistic national politics level.
I think to echo what's been said, I think the first thing is to be kind to one another. This is a very difficult and painful time, especially for people who are most under threat from Trump in the US, but around the world as well. His words have consequences globally, and I think it's really important that we take time to look after each other and be kind to one another. Secondly, I think we really all need to hold on to hope. There are many things wrong in the US and in Europe and elsewhere. There's nothing wrong with this country that can't be fixed with what's right in this country. I think we saw this after Southport. The day after those riots, in every street, local brickies and plasterers and local people coming out to fix walls and board up windows and to look after each other in that community. It didn't get as much coverage, but I think is a really important thing for us to remember, that there are good people doing good things and looking after each other in this country, and we should hold on to that hope. And thirdly, the thing to do is to do anything. We have to stay active and we have to keep going. And for some people, that means signing petitions or joining organisations or going on demonstrations, chipping in a few pounds, whatever it is. Every single act is an act of defiance to Donald Trump and people who share his politics, and also a contribution to the fight back that we need to have as a progressive movement. And I think that in this country, that particularly needs to take the form of saying to our government, don't back off the things that you said you'd do in the election. Don't back off the bold policies you said you would bring in to rebuild our economy and make it work for working people and to save the NHS and to protect our environment. They must not back off the things they said they would do. That would be giving in to Trumpism, but it would also hurt them and the country by being cautious in a time where that's the riskiest thing they could do.
Yeah, it's the opposite to what you were suggesting. They need to deliver on those things. That's the salvation. Fixing the things.
I have always said, even from the early days of the Romaniacs podcast, which some of you may remember, right up to now, that we have to be ever vigilant. You must never, ever take hard-won rights for granted, because they are so easily lost. And populism, it's never far away. It's only ever just below the surface, even in the good times for progressives. And they recalibrate and they pupate. And when you don't fight them, they rise up again. And Best for Britain will keep fighting, and I will keep fighting, and you must all keep fighting. And I would like to leave you with 2 quotes, not one because I'm greedy, 2 quotes from Karl Popper, who reminds us to this day, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society from the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them. But, he also said, the future is open. It is not predetermined. No one can predict it except by chance. We all contribute to determining it by what we do, and we are all equally responsible for its success. So be brave. Don't take any of this shit lying down. Get involved with our campaigns. Get involved with Quiet Riot, Best for Britain, 38 Degrees, Hope Not Hate and more, and defend our shared values today and every day.
My final thoughts: it's fine to be sad and angry. It's understandable, and it's probably healthy to express it. This is the worst case scenario. But I would say to people, and especially to international observers, because things are much worse for people in the US, try not to pitch in too enthusiastically on social media with nihilism. Take a breath. Try to steer clear from predicting second order and third order effects. They are notoriously unpredictable. We are in the moments after Dr. Martin Luther King was shot. We are in the moment after Pearl Harbor was bombed, or the moment after the Stonewall Inn was raided by police. Those are awful moments in themselves, but there is no way to glean how pivotal they become to what's coming. So I would echo your thoughts, Naomi. Despair is debilitating. Try not to fast forward to the end of history, especially while we still have a hand in making it.
There is so much more to discuss, but the clock has run out on what has been a very difficult day for so many of our supporters, our listeners, our viewers. Trump's triumph means the work of the podcast and Best for Britain and everybody else, all the fellow traveller campaigns, is more important than ever, and your ongoing support is crucial.
Thank you to everyone who has messaged us and joined the discussion on our Discord channel. At times like these, it's good to know there's a safe space where you can vent your frustrations with like-minded people. If you'd like to join it, head over to ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod and sign up as a supporter. Every pound helps keep this independent little podcast in the charts and bothering the bejesus out of its big-name rivals and ensuring that people like you give us a platform. Heaven knows we need it.
A big thank you to the Best for Britain team for all their help putting today's show together. We literally couldn't have done it without you guys. And for those of you at home, if you want to support that team as well as Quiet Riot, you can head to bestforbritain.org/donate.
And of course, thank you to our formidable guests, Mark, Matthew, your insight and opinion. It's been a pleasure, an education talking to you both.
Thank you all for tuning in. Quiet Riot will be back on Sunday with a weekend episode, and it will be a bumper edition for sure because there is so much more to cover.
No,
we haven't even touched on
Kelly Badenoch, that cabinet,
first
with her first
PMQs, yeah, the lot. So lots and lots and lots for us to get into.
Yeah, so make
weekend.
sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. But for now, keep quietly rioting, and goodbye.
Slava Ukraini. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreu and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global.
Quiet Riot.